I'm Ethan Snyder. I'm our Manager of Collections and Public Programs at the Wharton Esherick Museum. And today we're honored to be joined by two wonderful Andrews, Andy Gustine, who is our Building Preservation Specialist, and Andrew Fearon, who has done some really amazing work on the exterior of Esherick's 1966 silo. So we're going to begin. This is going to be kind of a conversational format today. So let me get my screen shared, and I'm going to start by just asking Andy Gustine a question to kind of catch us up. Um, can everyone see my screen? So Andy and I did a spotlight back in April talking about some of the work that he did to address a moisture issue. And the work that Andy did was primarily on the inside of the silo. So Andy, back in April, we spoke about this kind of remedial work that you did to address this moisture issue, the symptoms of which we see here on the screen. So do you want to chat with us a little bit, give us a brief summary of what you did to kind of set up Andrew's work on the exterior?
Sure. There were two primary recommendations from Building Conservation Associates and Michael Henry that we tackled. One was what I did was the interior side. There were recommendations for interior and exterior. I began with just removing a layer of rigid foam and then a second layer of plaster that was installed on the upper floor of what we call the dressing room, which is above the kitchen. And the concern was that that impermeable layer of insulation was exacerbating the moisture issues and so should be removed. Removing the layers also allowed us to see how the cracks in the original plaster underneath that were corresponding to cracks that we see on the exterior. And also, we will also be now inserting some probes that'll connect to data loggers. And so we can monitor the moisture and temperature in the wall going forward.
Great. So do you want to do the introduction of our wonderful
Yeah,
guest today, and then we'll get into asking Andrew some questions?
of course. Yeah, so as you mentioned, back in April, we did a talk that we discussed the findings of the BCA investigation. At the time, we were actually working out the details of the scope of work with our guest today, Andrew Fearon, who's the principal conservator at Heritage Conservation Collective in Philadelphia. We sealed the deal with them in June, and in July and August, Andrew was on site spending long, hot days up in an articulating lift basket. His work included meticulously inspecting, gently cleaning, mixing, color matching, repair materials to fill losses and cracks, and then touching up the color of some of these repairs with masonry paints and consolidating weathered areas with a conservation material called water glass. He was up there for 2 or 3 days a week for 5 weeks, not only executed the repair work that was prescribed, but also gave the whole silo a bath. I should mention that Andrew is also a lecturer in conservation at the University of Pennsylvania. And in 2019, the studio, workshop, and garage were the subject of his wood conservation seminar. So we've had been building a relationship with Andrew for whatever that is, 5, 6 years. So welcome, Andrew Fearon.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. I should also mention that Andrew has published over half a dozen essays and publications, many of which focus on Louis Kahn and Frank Lloyd Wright. So Andrew has been in this Esherick related world for a long time now, and we were honored to be able to work with him. So Andrew, let's get into it. So before we start talking about all the work you did in what seems like a pretty short amount of time, actually, when Andy lays out all the stuff you did, can you give us some context for Esherick's 1966 silo? And we can talk in a moment about contextualizing this within Esherick's other architectural work, and then also within the larger parameters of modern architecture.
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. First, quick thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. There's been many people involved in the project, and I just wanted to quickly mention them. Andrew Gustine has been there every day, as well as Julie. Ethan, thanks for setting this all up, and to all the Warren Esherick Museum staff for being so great throughout the whole process. I also want to give a big thanks to Preston Hall and the whole team at Building Conservation Associates for the great preliminary work that's been done, including Michael Henry's analysis. I also want to thank Donglin Chen at the University of Pennsylvania and Catherine Matson at Winterthur, University of Delaware, for their analytical work. Also, Frank Matero for facilitating all this through the Center for Architectural Conservation at the University of Pennsylvania. Also, Sarah Gadula at Heritage Conservation Collective for getting us set up and with the lift and the laser scan. All right, so that gets that out of the way. And yes, for context, well, a couple things here. We can get back to that flat image of a laser scan, but to start in there with context, as much as we think of Warren Esherick as an iconoclast designer, he was really at this center, the nexus of modern architecture and regional modernism that was very influenced by the vernacular landscape and rural farmland of Pennsylvania. Wharton was very interested in these silos that were in terracotta clay, and he commented on them. If Ethan, if we back up, I'll mention a couple other things I think I wanted. Yes, okay. So pictured here, at this time, he's just worked with Louis Kahn and Ann Ting using stucco over concrete block in the 1956 workshop, which is just adjacent this silo. So he had worked out a lot of the materials and began using it, concrete block and stucco, as a way to express forms. He famously took the rectilinear design of Lou Kahn's workshop design and curved the walls with CMU. And he really explores this in his commission for the Michael Watson residence in 1963, pictured on the left. And you could see the concrete block before it has received the stucco render. And you can see how he's achieving these very organic, expressive forms. And this is in contrast to another block and stucco project that he was well aware of and had some involvement in, and that's the Margaret Esherick house on the right from early 60s. Okay, next one. This is an example of that concrete, of the rather terracotta clay tile that he commented on, that these would produce different colors from the fertilizers and things that were stored in them. This is based on Bob Bascom's book, and we're all aware of Bob's book. It is really a primary source at this point. And where this falls into the larger global modernism that's happening in the post-war era, we have Le Corbusier's Cité Radiant in the south of France. You could see these silo-like structures, and I think Le Corbusier was also commented on these concrete silos that happened to influence global modernism. And so that was happening at the same time as something that Wharton certainly would have been familiar with. Next slide, please.
So let me ask you a little bit about your goals for this project. So you came in to kind of pick up where Andy left off. And what did you come in hoping and needing to achieve with the exterior of Esherick's silo?
Sure. Well, the primary goal, as Andy stated, as we came into it, was to arrest the water infiltration. There were these horizontal cracks and some network cracking and some other holes here and there that needed to be filled and tightened up. There were also some old restoration materials like caulk, and there was a cementatious patch that we removed and replaced with more reversible, more gentle conservation grade materials. Now, in order to do that, we had to clean a section to evaluate the patch and really to match it. This was a multicolored patch. In order to do that, we cleaned and we discovered that it was quite colorful underneath, and that sort of stimulated the idea that we would do a full-scale cleaning. And after discussion with the project team, we decided that it was beneficial to do a full-scale cleaning to remove all of the biogrowth and mold that had completely obscured the underlying color and mural. And I should say that the construction is concrete block with this layer of stucco, but that layer of stucco is comprised of a couple of different layers. One is a base coat, which probably has a little bit of lime in it, and then over that is a cementatious stucco, which is pigmented, and it's about a couple millimeters thick. So Wharton really painted on this mural with assistance, and there's some oral history of that as well.
Yeah. So let me just ask you quickly, what was the material that you used to clean the surface, and what is its applicability beyond Wharton Esherick's very specific structure here?
Okay, well, what was used was filtered water, basically. That was tested, and with some success. We started, we started testing steam, which began with filtered water. And then we tried a biological solution, D2, which was very effective. So we ended up using D2 on the whole thing because it worked particularly well. But the action was really mostly was water that was almost misted on, not really more than the pressure of a heavy rain. And it was slowly agitated with an automotive polyethylene brush, which is very, very soft, designed not to scratch car finishes. And the combination of that misting water and the D2, all of it really, it went, I think, Andy, it went by pretty quickly.
It was remarkable how quickly that came clean. I mean, not to take anything away from all your elbow grease, Andrew.
We tried to be really gentle. Yeah, and there was another part of your question, Ethan. Did I answer?
Yeah, you answered it for sure.
Okay.
So yeah, so let's get to some of the other work that you were doing. Can you tell us about this interestingly shaped patch, why it was there in the first place, and what you did with it?
Yeah, so part of the Esherick's original design, there's a junction between the wood and the masonry silo. And in between that, water was sort of like a waterfall dumping down right on the overdoor roof. And in that area, it was collecting a lot of moisture. The previous solution was to cut in a piece of sheet metal flashing called a riglet. And that was, that had actually exacerbated things a little bit. At that time, there was also a patch that was done, but that it hadn't aged well, and it was getting worse. So the thought was we would remove that, and that underlying patch, when we pulled it out, was out of a material that's not ideal, not very permeable, and not very flexible. So we replaced that with a pigmented natural hydraulic lime-based material, and yeah, that seemed to work well. The challenge there is that it has colors on all sides, so you have to make this multicolored patch. You can start matching the red, but then you soon have to kind of form this gradient. We didn't want this to stand out very much. So we tried our best to resolve it. And yeah, the line, I think if you see it now, we'll maybe look at some other after shots, but I think yeah, you can't really see that line. And yeah, I think it looks okay. Andrew, if you want to chime in.
I think it looks terrific. Yep, I was very impressed at your ability to put together the appropriate materials, but also to to creatively blend this all into that surface, because there is no uniformity. And so I suppose in a certain way that was maybe a bit of an asset, but at the same time, as you say, you had to transition from one color to another through another color. And no, I think it looks great.
Yeah. Andrew, do you feel like you gained a sense through this patching and color matching of what the original process in 1966 was really like? I know that we know kind of the steps and the process of how this was made, but did you feel like you were stepping into the shoes of Esherick and his collaborators in kind of doing this work?
Absolutely. You kind of all of a sudden you're thinking, trying to become the original installer, and yeah, trying to harness Esherick's energy and thought process there. So yeah, it was a good exercise, and I was able to do some mock-ups and some practice before that. We also investigated his original materials and original specifications, and there's a research and an analytical component to all of this work to support the treatment part.
Yeah, so to talk about analysis a little bit, well, before we get to that, do you want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing here with the cracks and the kind of patching you had to do before we
Yeah.
get to the testing and the analytics?
Sure. You could see on the right that the cracks were kind of caulked over with this clear silicone material that was marginally, effective for a period, but hadn't weathered very well. So that was removed, and in its place, we used that tinted hydraulic lime that we spoke of, and also, in addition, there's a fair amount of surface disaggregation around these zones of network cracking, and those required consolidation before they were filled. So it was a two-part process, and that consolidant was the inorganic potassium silicate or traditional water glass material that Andy mentioned.
Amazing. All right. So you want to talk to us a little bit about the sampling that you did and the testing and analytics that you're currently working on?
Yeah, we're kind of just getting started. Again, Donglin Chen, Catherine Matson had looked at the composition of the pigments. That was the goal for that project. In addition, looking at the thickness of these layers, we had no sense of really how thick they were or how consistent that was across the surface. We did some sampling, and you could see on the right, one of these cross sections is really maybe a couple, the green is maybe a couple of millimeters with the blue, but you could see it's very descriptive of the process where he put this ground layer on of one color. Well, I should say there's a base at the very bottom. You can see this light white colored. That's the base coat, which is untinted and likely has a little bit of lime. It's a little bit more softer and more flexible. On top of that is a pigmented layer of green as a base coat, and then on top of that there is blue in this case, and it varies with red and yellow and green and blue all over the surface, and that you might see 3 layers of color. They might blend into one another. There are these feathered edges everywhere, and that makes it a complex surface.
Yeah. So as you were up in this lift for 5 weeks, did the work overall go as you expected? And were there any unexpected discoveries that you might have made along the way?
Well, the biggest discovery was the cleaning. I think that through this we have a different understanding of the whole compound. It's such a central feature. I think other than that, it was well, it was okay in terms of what we tried to accomplish. We won't really know until we evaluate it over a period of years, really. So we can't say everything's perfect at this point. But I think one of the things that I was not perfect was that the only place we could put the lift, there wasn't a lot of different, you know, places to choose from. It really had to be right in the center. And this is a pretty big 30, 40-foot lift. And there's just everybody, the whole staff recognized that there wasn't quite enough room for that lift in the space. And what that meant would be that I would have to traverse up in the air to cross over. There wasn't enough clearance. And that was quite nerve-wracking given the fragility and the importance of this work, to have this 10,000-pound lift right next to it which would be ideal to kind of demo it if it had a wrecking ball on it. I really that part was a little bit nerve-wracking, but I think the rest of the installation of the crack filling and all of that, and we even had a little room for the cleaning. It was somewhat, I think, what was on. Were we on schedule, Andy?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think you had originally planned 4 weeks, and it ended up being 5. But the way the lift rental worked out, we were able to squeeze in a 5th week within the 30-day lift rental. It all, yeah. I can't imagine it going better, honestly.
Yeah. So one of the most exciting things for me as a staff member at the Esherick about this project is something that is actually pretty arguably immaterial, and that is new interpretations of this silo. So since I've been at the Esherick since 2019, we have interpreted the mural on this structure as a forest in the autumn. But Andrew, as you spent your 5 weeks up on this lift that we see here on the left, and this mural slowly and slowly came forth as it was cleaned, you started to think about it a little differently. Do you want to tell us about some of your interpretations and theories for this mural?
Sure. After a week of cleaning, it started to dry out, and when it's wet, you can't really see the color. So it was after that week when it started to dry out, you could really begin to see the subtle shifts in colors as they bled together. Some of the forms of the upper areas were almost entirely covered in biogrowth, and I began to consider it much more as a cohesive mural or work of art. I make this connection. I think of the late phase of abstract expressionism, like the color field painters like Mark Rothko, that manipulates this bleeding of two colors that's dramatic and powerful and expressive and full of emotion. And the whole work, now that you could see it, you could see the subtle qualities of texture. It's handcrafted. This is a sanded, hand troweled finish, and it has a lot of body and texture to it. And when you see the light rake across it, it all sort of comes alive. And this is very much related to his woodwork, his vocabulary, where you see this monochrome of natural wood tones, and then somewhere, whether it's behind a cabinet or in a drawer, there's this splash of color. It's often this blue sea green, but I really think of the silo as this splash of color, and the rest, is his woodwork. Yeah, that's how I see it now.
And you were also telling me a little bit about how you might not think it's a forest in the autumn, but something a little different. Do you want to tell folks about that?
Yeah, so what became apparent, it looks as if the light is piercing through the canopy and projects these yellow and greens on the side. It's a little different than this red clay tile inspiration. I think that seems to be somewhat intentional, the color selection, that it's related to the canopy and the way the light in that area really projects onto a side of a silo in the vernacular landscape. In this case, it's this expressionist work of art, but yeah, it does evoke the light in the trees.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's so important to realize that projects like this lead us to interpret structures and materials and artwork in completely new ways. And I think that while this photo on the left still shows the silo dirty, we can kind of see the light filtering through the trees in the background, which pairs pretty nicely with a very clean silo. So I'm going to go back to this flat laser scan here, since you kind of talked about this as a work of art in the vein of abstract expressionism. I'm going to ask you an unrelated question. So one thing that I'm really excited to hear you talk about are kind of the takeaways from this project for you, and what you think the kind of applicability of your findings are as it relates to modern architecture at large, concrete and stucco structures as well. So how do we take the silo off of the Wharton Esherick Museum campus, and how does it allow us to understand structures of the same material, structures from the same time period in different ways?
Yeah, well, as part of the investigation, there's the issue of disaggregation, and from that, Donglin Chen, the graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, is pursuing the problem of surface disaggregation that we notice is a real problem. And what she's doing is researching inorganic consolidants like potassium silicate and some others to really that we can perhaps test and then evaluate long term to slow this weathering process. And that material and that combination, looking at concrete and concrete stucco and cementitious materials, that has a broader application. So the hope with this thesis is that we use Wharton Esherick as a testing, to develop a testing program scientifically with a parallel laboratory program that has a broader application for consolidating exterior renders, plasters, and other things that have cementitious materials, which is very much a very modern era material. So I think in looking at architectural conservation applied to modern architecture, this is very useful for that. And the hope is that it will have some application.
Yeah, that's so exciting. That's so exciting for us to know that your work on this structure can help other, modernist pieces of modernist architecture to be preserved and conserved. And it's really nice to know that we can learn so much from this. So to round things out, Andrew, I want to ask, what is next for the silo? What's its future look like, and how can we try to avoid future buildups, future weathering, future cracking, so that we don't return to this issue in a number of years?
Well, one, I feel like we do need to get ahead of the disaggregation, and I wanted to say that we follow this conservation careful scientific methodology where we want to affect the material as little as possibly adversely, so we don't want to damage it in any way, or affect it, even leave it undisturbed where possible if it's stable. On the back, so we haven't cleaned or treated the back for that reason, sort of following that methodology. I would like to see a couple of things happen, and this is something that Andy and I are always in discussion about, but there needs to be, I think, more of a subgrade assessment of the foundation, that it has to be absolutely stable, and there has been some issues in the past, so we want to make sure that the foundation is stable. The way the drainage kind of goes around the base is also not perfect, needs to be addressed. There's stairs that are tilted the wrong way, and that usually doesn't get better on its own, Andrew knows. And yeah, I think there are also, in terms of the biogrowth, there needs to be a preventive maintenance schedule implemented. And one of the interesting things I think that the silo might be a candidate for to test is the use of solid zinc, a metal capping of those. It's dissolvable zinc, and it will disassociate. Those ions will disassociate and collect on the surface, and theoretically prevent biogrowth. So that's one of the things that Andy and I are talking about to prevent it long term. But monitoring is critical. Understanding if all this stuff that we are doing actually works over a period of time. And the way we do that is through documentation. So we're able to do this laser scan that's a colored laser scan that really details everything. And we'd like to do an after scan. If we come up with the money, we're hoping to do an after scan, and that will give us sort of a baseline that we can look at you could see that this round scan has been then flattened out. But it's a very high resolution document, and you can zoom in and see all those little cracks to like a sub-millimeter level. So it's a very useful part of documentation. So documentation, monitoring, more assessment, more research, and really addressing that problem of water infiltration, number one, and also surface disaggregation long term.
Yeah, those are a lot of doctor's orders, but yeah, absolutely. So
well, I would just say too, I'll just chime in that, you know, all the treatments that Andrew has done, everything, including the cleaning, any kind of treatment like this sort of has a lifespan of its own. So none of this is sort of like over and done. These are all, you know, every step of the way we're gaining more information, more knowledge about how to treat it in the future, how to maybe make adjustments when we have cracks to fill the next time, or losses, and you know, and the kind of treatments that Donglin is investigating, as Andrew said, just making sure that whatever good they're doing, there isn't a bad side to them, or you know, I mean, that's kind of been the holy grail of these kinds of surfaces, you know, going back as long as I have been interested in these things. It's easy enough to find something to spray on a surface and have it keep the water, you know, reduce the water absorption, but how do you have that same material allow for drying, you know, have a surface that a consolidant that doesn't cause more trouble than it solves. So we're yeah, happy to be putting all this into practice and continue to learn as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's open it up for questions, because I imagine the group has some questions that they love to ask the two of you.
Talk.
Yes. Is it possible to use siloxane on that surface at all?
Well, I don't, you know, we haven't eliminated everything, you know, we're considering everything, but yeah, that's part of the investigation, to look at all of the organic and inorganic. But we'll say that we're looking at the inorganics, and potassium silicate is one of them. But yeah, certainly it's worthy of consideration.
Got a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, what did Wharton use for pigment?
Well, it's a good question, and I didn't really get to talk more about the results of the pigment analysis, so thanks for that opportunity. So ultramarine blue was used with Kahn and Ting just adjacent, and we think that that's what he was using for the blue in the silo through two forms of instrumental analysis. One is FTIR, the other is XRF, which identifies certain elements that we associate those particular pigments. So ultramarine blue, chrome green for the green, and then iron oxides for the reds and yellows. They're different oxidation states of iron oxide typically. So that's where we're at, but it's not always straightforward because they're in this cementitious media, so they have to be really isolated before you can identify them. It's not totally straightforward.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up question to that. Are the types of pigments and their, I guess, material constitution similar for what Esherick used for the silo as what he would have been using decades earlier as a painter?
Well, all of this is all interesting because his studio and all of his pigments are there in the garage. Some of them have been accumulated and later in by Bob and so on, but I think there's some old, that looks like some old materials in there. And Don Glynn also found really interesting information on proprietary colored stuccos that were locally available. So that's also something that we're looking into. We did test some of the pigments that were there, such as the rainbow pigments, but they were, they weren't a match, and they were later and filled with a lot of fillers. So yeah, we're still, that question still needs to be answered.
Okay. And then we have a question from Jonathan asking, what is on the top of the silo, and does that need additional treatment?
Yeah, so the top of the silo terminates in this short parapet wall. Andy, it's maybe 12 inches, so it's not very high.
Right.
And then the stucco extends all the way around that, which isn't great for something that receives snow and it just sort of sits there in the rain. So one of the things that we've considered is capping that with a sacrificial wash of the same natural lime material, but also maybe pairing that with a zinc cap that wouldn't be visible from the ground, but would help to deter some of the biogrowth. So part of the issue with the structure is that the top isn't so perfect in terms of its design. It'd be nice if it was we had a roof of some kind, I suppose, but that wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be as satisfying as a work of modernism, I suppose.
And I don't know exactly what when you say the top. So as Andrew is describing the top of the walls, but there is hidden from view a roof surface that is a metal roof, and that roof is in good condition. But it is the perimeter walls and the way they terminate kind of with a bare top that is the challenge. So just in case that helps to clarify, maybe.
Yeah, it's a flat seam roof, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And if you're curious to see more about that, check out our YouTube channel or our website, because our spotlight with Andy Gustine back in April has some great photographs of the top of the silo. And when we send out our follow-up, we'll be sure to link everyone to that video as well. It's kind of a part one to this. Yeah. So if we don't have any more questions, just a couple of announcements for upcoming events at the Wharton Esherick Museum. So this Sunday, November 3rd at 3:30 p.m., we have a concert performance with the Ursinus String Ensemble in the 1956 workshop. And they'll be playing a version of As I Watched the Plowman Plowing, which is a score that Esherick illustrated in the early 30s, I want to say. We have another plein air day with the Brandywine Museum of Art coming up on Wednesday, November 13th at 9:30 a.m. So if you're interested in spending some time outdoors on WEM's campus and getting your hands dirty with some paint, check that out on our website. And then 2 events with more information to come. We're planning an open house and holiday market in early December as well as a poetry reading to mark the solstice on December 21st. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for announcements about those two programs. And otherwise, let's just give Andrew and Andy a round of applause for their work and their presentation today, because it was really wonderful. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, and I doubt that this will be the last we hear of the silo. So I'm sure we will be having a part 3 and a part 4 sometime in the coming years.
Indeed. Looking forward to that.
Yes.